Okay. Welcome. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dalton Fogarty, and I am the Undergraduate Fellow of Senate for the University of Sydney, and I will be your MC for this evening. Before we begin the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge...
Yeah, there we go. So, the topic for this evening is, should voluntary euthanasia be legalized? As was mentioned before, Peter Singer will be opening the affirmative case. He'll have 12 minutes to speak.
Thank you very much. And let me say I welcome the opportunity to debate this important public issue with Archbishop Anthony Fisher, and I thank him for accepting the invitation. I thank the University of Sydney and the Sydney University Catholic Society and all of those involved in it for having set up this opportunity. We are debating whether voluntary euthanasia should be legalized. So we have to ask, what do we mean by voluntary euthanasia? Anthony Fisher debated with Philip Nitschke a few years ago, and in the course of that debate he defined euthanasia as an act or calculated course of omission intended to shorten life with a supposedly merciful motivation. I'll accept that definition, so we don't have to argue about definitions. And of course, we have the term voluntary in there, so that means that the act or calculated course of omission must be performed at the request of the patient. I'd add, at the informed and considered request of the patient. It's important to note that this definition includes what is sometimes known, particularly in the United States, as physician-assisted dying, but I don't want to be accused of sheltering behind euphemisms, so let's just call it physician-assisted suicide. It includes a situation in which a patient, perhaps a terminally ill patient, depending on how the legislation is framed, patients they may ask their doctors for prescriptions for drugs that, when the prescription is filled and when the patient takes the drug, will cause them to die quickly and without distress. The legalization of physician-assisted suicide would permit doctors to write such prescriptions on the request of their patient and after complying with whatever conditions the legislation lays down. This practice is legal in the United States, in the states of Oregon, Washington, Montana, and Vermont. It's also legal in Switzerland. And it will also, I expect, within the next 6 months, become legal across all of Canada, following a recent unanimous decision of the Supreme Court of Canada that struck down as unconstitutional laws that prohibited competent adults who were terminally ill or suffering from grievous and irremediable medical conditions from having such assistance from a physician who was willing to provide it. Now, I acknowledge that personally I don't see a great deal of ethical significance in the distinction between what I've just described and called physician-assisted suicide and the form of voluntary euthanasia that is legal now in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Luxembourg, and in Colombia, where terminally or incurably ill patients can request a lethal injection from their doctors, and the doctors can, if it is in accordance with their own conscience, give that injection. And I'd be very surprised if Anthony Fisher disagrees with me in saying that these two are morally equivalent or very close at least. But we might believe that legalizing physician-assisted suicide, while not permitting a doctor to give a lethal injection, makes it more difficult for the practice to be abused by extending it to patients without their consent. And if we believe that, not saying whether we should, but it's possible, then we might think it more prudent to legalize only physician-assisted suicide. In any case, here's the key takeaway from what I'm doing with this discussion of the ways in which a doctor can intentionally perform at the patient's request a life-shortening act. If you agree that we should have laws similar to those that exist now in Oregon, Washington, etc., then you are agreeing with me that voluntary euthanasia should be legalized. You don't have to also go the step of saying we should have a law that allows doctors to give lethal injections. You may or may not think of that. Both are, as I've defined the term using Anthony Fisher's definition, both are forms of euthanasia. I should also say under what circumstances I believe voluntary euthanasia should be legal. I'm not an absolutist about autonomy. I do not want to make it easy for people to end their lives because of a condition that may be treatable or from which they have a reasonable prospect of recovery. In Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, a patient must be terminally ill. That is, according to legislation, 2 doctors must certify that the patient cannot reasonably be expected to live for another 6 months. That's one possible standard under which we could legalise voluntary euthanasia. My preference is the standard used by the Supreme Court of Canada in its constitutional decision, which says it should be permissible for competent adults who request it and who have a grievous and irremediable medical condition that causes enduring suffering. But again, as I say, under the terms of our debate, we don't need to go that further step with the incurable condition. If I can only convince you that patients who are terminally ill and where 2 doctors say they are not likely to live for 6 months, that's the only conditions under which it can be legalised, well, it's still the case that you're agreeing with me that voluntary euthanasia should be legalised. Now that we know what we're debating, why should voluntary euthanasia be legalised? To answer that question, I think we should ask another one. Why should do we normally consider killing an innocent person to be wrong? Not only wrong, but also properly a crime. That's a very basic question, clearly. We don't often ask ourselves, we take it for granted. But if we do, I think there's 2 important reasons why we should think that to be both wrong and a crime. Firstly, it's a violation of the autonomy of the person killed. In fact, it's the most, typically anyway, it's the most serious possible violation of that person's autonomy. It denies that person everything that they wanted to do for the rest of their life. Now you've killed them, they can't do it. So whatever their hopes and wishes and plans were, whatever it was they wanted to achieve, you've prevented them doing that, typically against their will because they wanted to go on living, they wanted to do those things. So that's one important reason why we rightly make killing a serious crime. But clearly, in the case of voluntary euthanasia, the value that we properly place on autonomy does not count against assisting the patient to die, against physician-assisted suicide. It counts in favour of it, because that is the autonomous wish of the patient that you are fulfilling. Now, I think autonomy, as I say, is rightly a value, but I don't think it overrides all other values. For example, I don't think that a lovesick young adult who's in despair because the one he loves has rejected him or her, and therefore wants to die, I don't think you should regard that as a wish that you ought to fulfill or to assist. Even if you think it is, at this moment, this person's autonomous wish, you can safely predict that that mood will pass, that the young person will, in future, come to think of his or her life as well worth living, and you could then reasonably conclude that the value of that life and everything the person will obtain and be able to do through that life overrides the temporary violation of autonomy or liberty in that case. And that brings me to the second reason why we normally consider killing both morally wrong and a serious crime. Killing deprives the person of whatever good things that person would have experienced for the rest of their life. And I think we can be sufficiently optimistic to say that for most people, the rest of their life will typically bring a positive balance, more good things than bad things. So that too is a good reason why killing should be regarded as something that's wrong. But again, in the case of voluntary euthanasia, that reason no longer counts against killing, it actually counts in favour of killing. Because there the person has judged that the rest of their life cannot have a positive balance. They don't want it. They're the best judge, surely, assuming we're talking about a competent, well-informed adult and so on, they're the best judge of whether the quality of their life is still acceptable. And with the informed views of doctors about whether it can be expected to get better or not, they are in the best position to say, no, the rest of my life quest, because it will save the person from bad experience. So I think we can conclude that the law against killing should not be absolute. It gives us no grounds for making it a crime when a competent person requests assistance with ending his or her life and has good reasons based on a terminal or an irremediable illness that has eliminated the patient's prospects of having an acceptable quality of life to make that request. In those circumstances, to assist that person in ending his or her life is not morally wrong and in a free society should not be a crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Singer. Archbishop Anthony Fisher to present the case for the negative.
Thank you, Scott, Mr. Chairman, and my alma mater, Sydney University and its Catholic Society, and Peter Singer. The recent film, The Water Diviner, was inspired by a true story of an Australian farmer who travelled to Turkey after World War I to discover the fate of his 3 sons who'd been reported missing in action at Gallipoli. A spoiler alert for those who haven't seen the film, and cover your ears. Towards the end of the film, Joshua Connor, played by Russell Crowe, finds his eldest son, Arthur, still alive. Art tells his father how his youngest brother, Henry, died. He died after being shot by the Turks. He bled out painfully for hours and finally begged his brother Art to shoot him, and Art did so. Art's anguish since killing his brother is evident in the film, but the film portrays his act sympathetically. A parallel story from the next World War is that of the brothers Stan and Butch Bissett. They grew up playing football together, enlisted together, fought side by side on the Kokoda track, until in 1942, Butch was severely wounded by Japanese machine gun fire. The platoon doctor could do nothing more for him than give him morphine. And so Stan held his brother Butch in his arms for 6 hours until he died. They sat laughing, crying, remembering the good times of their childhood, the trouble they got up to as kids, the times they played rugby together. Butch faded in and out of consciousness, and Stan shared one last song with his brother Butch as he breathed his last. These are examples of 2 different responses to human suffering and dying. Both are motivated by mercy. Both win our sympathy. The first says it's better to kill someone than let them suffer. Better to fulfill someone's request to be killed than to resist it. It's premised on the view that some lives are so wretched, or personal autonomy so important, that justifies killing. The second story accepts the reality of physical and psychological and spiritual pain, but deals with suffering not by killing the suffering person, but by giving them every reasonable assistance and accompanying them in love and care. Arguably, that second approach puts a higher value on human life and relationships, but also is more demanding. It asks more of people. Professor Singer's view of life is that its point is fulfilling preferences. Whereas on my view, human life has an intrinsic meaning. It's intrinsically valuable. However reduced our condition, we have a radical dignity from our first breath to our last. And that's the basis of our equality and our human rights. It's the reason we protect even the hopeless. So that while every moral means should be used to relieve suffering, doctors must never kill their patients. In humility, they recognise that sometimes there's nothing more ethically and practically to be done than standing by and investing ourselves in someone's care. Now, many people think that pain and suffering should, where reasonable, be minimised. I agree, as long as we hold on to the where reasonable bit. Where people might differ is that I think the suffering person, killing the suffering person, is never the reasonable way to deal with their suffering. But even if you're agnostic on that question of whether killing is ever permitted, you'd surely agree that if mercy drives us in this area, we'd first be ensuring that everything possible was done to relieve people's pain and suffering. We'd ensure that every person who could benefit had access to appropriate pain management and pastoral care. Yet we know that millions of people in our world and thousands of people in Australia die every year without access to palliative care. Furthermore, if relieving suffering is what the euthanasia debate is all about, then we have to be honest with ourselves about where that leads. Because euthanasia can relieve suffering not just of dying people, but of the seriously sick, the mentally ill, those tired of life, not just competent adults, but babies, children, the unconscious, the disabled, as Professor Singer has argued elsewhere. In this, he's just being consistent. If it's about relieving suffering, there are a lot more people who are suffering than those who are terminally ill or have some very, very serious medical problem. Of course, relief of suffering isn't the only reason that he or others argue for euthanasia's being legalised. They also argue on the basis of autonomy, that it's what people want, but sometimes they judge that their quality of life is so low they don't want to continue. If it's out of that kind of respect for autonomy that some euthanasia enthusiasts want the euthanasia pill available much more broadly, even to healthy people, even to teenagers. The freedom to die when and how I want can't reasonably be restricted just to the hard cases. No wonder then that wherever euthanasia has been legalised, it's gradually extended to more and more people. It's not that euthanasia cultures are uniquely made up of moral monsters. It's that that is where the logic of autonomy-based euthanasia or relief of suffering-based euthanasia will lead you. Euthanasia regimes, in my view, actually reduce people's autonomy because they embed the social expectation that certain people will elect death. People whose autonomy is already reduced by pain, fear, depression. Yet the message that they are no longer protected by homicide laws and might be better off dead. Having classed the frail, elderly, disabled and others as expendable, the community is likely to do less for them and leave them feeling worthless. So ironically, in the name of autonomy, people's freedom is narrowed and their very lives, the premise of their freedom, put at risk. Till now, it's been a defining aspect of our health professions that they never kill or harm their patients. International and national codes of medical and nursing ethics all forbid euthanasia. Do we want our health professionals assessing which patients should live and which should die? Do we want them gradually desensitised to harming and killing? Do we want medical students trained in giving lethal doses? Legalising euthanasia would be a revolution in medical practice and nursing practice. It would undermine the save, heal, care ethic and our trust in health professionals and place a terrible burden on those professionals. Till now, it's been a defining aspect of our law that human life is protected, that human rights are universal, that there are no exceptions to our homicide laws. But legal euthanasia would create two classes of citizens. Those whose lives are inviolable, most of us, and those whose lives can be taken, the terminally ill, disabled, and some others. I think the first purpose of law is to protect the innocent and vulnerable. And I think it's that belief that is the basis of most Australians' opposition to state-sanctioned killing, even of criminals. It's that the prohibition on killing is a cornerstone of our law and social relationships and protects each of us impartially and equally. Finally, who dies in a euthanasia culture? The weak, the frail, elderly, the sick, the handicapped, the depressed, babies. No wonder that advocates for the elderly and for those with disabilities oppose euthanasia much of the time. As one put it, we're scared enough already. We'll be terrified if euthanasia becomes state-sanctioned. Euthanasia is sold to the community as being for the extreme cases of unrelievable pain, especially for the terminally ill. But then it's extended to those who are chronically sick, those with mental illnesses, those with existential despair. There is bracket creep in euthanasia. It evolves. First, we're told it's for competent, informed, consenting adults only. And then it's extended to the incompetent, the unconscious, babies. First, it's for those who judge their own lives to be too burdensome for them. But how quickly societies that go down that path start making the judgment that those lives are too burdensome for others. Putting Granny out of her misery so easily becomes putting Granny out of our misery. The bracket creep is built into the very logic of euthanasia. Once we start deciding that death is in the best interests of some people, then of course there will be others in the queue. That's exactly what's happened in Holland and in Belgium that have been offered to us as examples of voluntary euthanasia working well tonight. In Holland, it was supposed to be for people in extreme suffering, consenting adults. But after 10 or so years of that experience, it became legal to do it for babies. Now, it's the ordinary way of dying for about 5,000 people in the Netherlands every year, not just extreme, unrelievable suffering. We all want to relieve suffering. We all want to respect autonomy. Surely we can find respectful, life-affirming ways of doing that don't involve killing each other, and in the process, putting the most vulnerable in our community at risk.